So we're talking about the RDL or Romanian deadlift, and we'll start by saying what makes this different than a regular deadlift or a conventional deadlift. And the answer is just less knee bend. That's really it. It's not that it starts from the top or any of these other things that you might hear. The big difference is we just have less knee bend so that we're targeting the glutes and hams a little bit more. We are removing some of the quad element of this exercise to make it a little bit more specific to those posterior chain muscles, the glutes and the hams. So the RDL is a hip hinge movement, which means we're gonna have a lot of movement at the hip and not a lot of movement at the knees. In contrast, a squat is where we have roughly equal movement between the hips and the knees. A squat is where you're hip hinging and knee bending simultaneously. And we'll have other movements that we do, whether it's a hack squat or a sissy squat or quad emphasis leg press or quad emphasis split squat, where we talk about having a lot of knee movement without a lot of hip movement. And so the RDL is a hip hinge movement. Primarily, I want you guys to think of it as a backwards and forwards movement, not an up and down movement. A lot of people think about going down. We're gonna be thinking about going back, sending our hips back. That's what puts tension on the glutes and the hamstrings, is moving your hips horizontally away from the bar. It's not about going down this way. It's about moving your hips horizontally away from the bar. So while if you're sending a form video, I usually will want a side view, because as you'll see later in the video, that's where most of the technique stuff comes into play. You still need to set up where your hands are on the bar and how wide your feet should be. And so for an RDL, what you want is your feet coming straight down out of your hips, right? Not out here where they're a little bit wider than my hips, and not feet together. And so something like this is going to be just fine. It should feel relatively natural to you. If you're not sure, there's a nice little trick. If you just look up and you wipe your shoes as if you were coming inside, you just got muddy or whatever, chances are they'll land in a good spot here. Another way of kind of figuring that out is if you were to take a step and go to jump, that's where your feet would be. And so it's a pretty powerful stance, feet coming right out of the hips. You want your toes or your feet pointed forward or just ever so slightly rotated out. We don't want a lot of external rotation of the feet here, right? I want my feet pointed as forward as is comfortable for me, and pointed straight forward is going to be most comfortable, or is going to be comfortable for most people most of the time, and so give that a shot. As far as where you place your hands, you want your hands outside of your hips here, right? And so they're not knocking into the knees as we go through the movement. And so for me, this is a good spot just like this. Now, I highly recommend using a pair of Versa grips or lifting straps, as gripping the bar is gonna be a limiting factor for a lot of you guys. Seriously, if you feel like, Jordan, I could do more, but my grip is slipping, great, we have tools for that. Get a pair of wrist straps, or better yet, get a pair of Versa grips. If you're gonna get Versa grips, get a Versa Grip Pro. It has a little bit longer strap, whatever. But in the meantime, if you don't have any of that, you are finding that your grip is a limiting factor, I recommend doing what's called a mixed grip, where you have one hand over and one hand under, and that actually kind of makes one hand strong where the other hand is weak, and actually really does help. Now, in the very long term, if you're gonna be RDLing for the next 20, 30 years, 50 years, I do recommend going with a double overhand grip and using a pair of Versa grips. You're gonna find that it is a complete game changer in terms of grip strength. Now, again, if you have a squat rack, it's really nice to set the bar up below waist height such that I can just lift this up and step out and start my set. Now, ideally, actually, I would be facing the other direction. I don't recommend you starting inside your rack and walking back, because then when you're done with your set, let's say I were to do this, when you're done with your set and you're really tired, you have to walk backwards, and I don't recommend that. I want you walking forwards when you are fatigued. So if you're working in a squat rack, I want you facing in, such that when you begin the set, you're walking backwards, and when you finish the set, you're walking forwards. Now, it's not the end of the world, but I do recommend that when you're really fatigued, you set yourself up so you're putting the bar back forward, not backwards. And additionally, if you have a squat rack, yes, it's really great. You can set this up at waist height, but if you don't, you can just start this from the floor. It doesn't matter. It's not a big deal. It's really nice to be able to set it up here, because when you're done with your set, you walk it in, and when you start your set, you can just pick it up from here and get going. But it isn't the only way to do it. It's not such a big deal. You can just start from the floor. It really doesn't matter. Now we're gonna switch to a side view, and we're gonna talk about what we can see from there. So we talked about the RDL being a forward and back movement. Now, what do I mean by that? Instead of it being a down and up movement where you're thinking about going down this way, I want you thinking about pushing your hips that way. And that's really how we load the glutes and the hamstrings. we push our hips horizontally away from the load here, right? And so that's what I want you to think about. Whether you think about, pushing your hips back like you're closing a car door with a bunch of groceries in your hand, whatever works for you, I want you to think about this being a backwards and forwards movement, not a down and up movement. And so doing so often leads to better technique, and it is essentially more accurately what we are doing, is moving backwards and forwards. Now, when it comes to how close to your body the bar should be, a lot of people have said things like the bar has to touch your body the entire way down. It doesn't, but what you definitely don't want to do is push the bar away from you. And so I would say keep the bar close to your body at all times, but don't stress if it moves a little bit forward. It's really not the end of the world. Now, if you are somebody who doesn't have a squat rack, right, and you are working from the floor, which by the way is totally fine. People freak out about the RDL. Oh, it's got to start at the top. Who cares? If you're picking it up from the floor though, it's likely going to be very far away. It's likely going to be lower than you can actually RDL, and you're going to have to pick it up with more of a traditional deadlift technique. And so please do not do this, right? And then get started. Gonna hurt yourself. I want you to pick up that first rep with good technique and a neutral spine, just a little bit more knee bend. And so you're gonna go down and do more of a traditional deadlift technique where you bend the knees, nice neutral flat back, pick up the bar, and then you can start your technique, right? And so if you're picking up the bar from the ground, don't pick it up like an ass. Pick it up like you're trying to take care of your back, right? A little bit more knee bend, neutral spine, pick it up, and then get started. Now, the last two things we're gonna cover is how much knee bend and how low should you go. We're gonna start with that second one because I do think that that's the biggest issue with the RDL with most people, is that they're not getting the right balance of range of motion and loading. We're going too heavy and not deep enough. And so what I want you to do is I want you to go as low as you can with a neutral spine. And I know we talked about this being a back and forward movement, but sometimes once you have that down, you can start to identify where the bar finishes on your legs. And so for me, I know that that's about mid-shin. And so if we look at my RDL technique here, it's gonna look something like this, where I stop right about mid-shin. And I start to learn what that feels like so that I can recreate that range of motion every rep. Now, if I were to go too low, it would look something like this. And I want you to look at my lower back because again, we're trying to go as low as we can while maintaining a neutral spine. And so this would be me violating that and going too low. Here, 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 right about here. I know I'm gonna lose that neutral spine right there. If I go any deeper, I'm kind of dumping into this rounded back position. And so it's gonna take a little bit of exploration, but for most of you guys, it means doing a little less weight for a little bit more range of motion. Good right here, nice and neutral, not good right here, right? Good right here, nice and neutral, not good right here. And so it'll be a little bit of guess and check. I'm happy to look at form videos. Trust me, this is the #1 thing I'm looking at in form videos. And so that's why I recommend a side view so I can kind of see how low are you getting, what's your lower back look like, all of that stuff. And last but not least, how much should you bend your knees? Now you're gonna hear a lot about bending the knees more, works the glutes more, bending the knees less, works the hamstrings less. Now that is true. However, what I recommend you do is I recommend you start with just thinking about a soft knee bend. I would rather you focus on getting a technique where you feel really strong, a level of knee bend where you feel really stable, really strong, and you can recreate that technique from week to week. Before you think so much about, oh, I need more knee bend for glutes or less knee bend for hams, I just want you to think about a soft knee bend that feels comfortable for you, where you're stable and strong and you can recreate it week to week. And so before you're thinking, during the movement, there's so much shit to think about. I don't want you being like, I need more knee bend for more glutes, more knee bend for more glutes. Because at the end of the day, if you use so much knee bend, and I'll show you right now what a lot of knee bend would look like, a very glute dominant technique probably looks like this, let's say. Very, very glute dominant RDL here. Do a couple reps there. Very glute dominant RDL here. Now, if you're gonna use more knee bend, You must maintain a vertical shin. I'm not trying to be a hard ass about it, but if you just let the knees go forward, it becomes a squat or a deadlift. I still need it to be an RDL, and what that means is if you watch my shins, I want the knees to never travel forward, right? The knees are gonna stay in exactly the same place. Even as I'm bending my knees more, it's coming from my hips moving back, right? If I were to pursue a lot of knee bend even more, my knees would start to travel forward. See? I want the shins to be vertical, and I want that movement happening from pushing the hips back. Now, if you were going to use less knee bend because you want to work the hamstrings more, it would look a little bit more like this. And you'll see that I will get not as deep. I won't be able to go as low because I'm not bending my knees, which allows me to get lower. And so a really soft knee bend, pretty stiff leg. This is the end of my range of motion here, and I'm back up. And so if you want to work more glutes, you can use a little bit more knee bend. If you want to use more hamstrings, you can use a little bit less knee bend. But I'll be honest with you, please, I would recommend you start by just thinking soft knee bend. Where am I comfortable? Send my hips back. What feels right to me? Where am I strong? Where am I stable? Because at the end of the day, it's not like more knee bend turns the hamstrings off and less knee bend turns the glutes off. They both work a ton in both techniques. You're just biasing one a little bit more. And frankly, if you use a really bent knee, let's say you're on like team gotta get huge glutes, if you bend the knees a ton, it becomes very similar to a lot of the other movements that we do, a lot of the squats, the split squats, the leg presses, the step ups, right? Where you have this sort of like 90-degree shin angle or 90-degree knee angle, right? Now, I'm not telling you which one to do. I just want you to find a stable technique that works for you with a soft knee bend. And I can imagine that a lot of you, for a lot of you, that this can become somewhat of an analysis by paralysis sort of thing, or paralysis by analysis sort of thing. And so if you're feeling that way, just think about having a nice soft knee bend, sending the hips back, keeping the bar close, and doing what feels right and stable for you at the moment. And so I'll finish with, something of a full set here, and we can take a look at what it looks like in action. Actually, I lied. Last two things we are going to talk about is head position and arching of the lower back. And so from a head position standpoint, it's really simple. The only thing I don't want you to do is go down in your RDL and cock your head up like this. And so as you descend, a lot of people think about looking, up, and they do this. It's not the end of the world, by the way. You're not going to snap your neck. Your head's not going to fall off your body. But what I would recommend is as you descend, tucking that head into neutral. And so a lot of times what that means is looking diagonally down in front of you, right? And so as you go down like this, looking more in this direction. If you look up, your head's not gonna you're not gonna get decapitated, right? You're gonna be okay. But I do recommend, just from a general safety for the very, 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 very long term that you're gonna be trying to do this, I recommend keeping that spine from head to butt in neutral here. Now, you'll also hear a lot about not anterior tilting, right? So this pelvic movement of dumping my pelvis forward like this, anterior tilting, you're gonna hear a lot that that's a really bad thing. I don't think it's such a bad thing inherently. What I want you to think about doing is you are gonna have to arch your lower back a little bit. You are gonna have to extend through the lower back a little bit to keep it in neutral. And so while your goal is a neutral spine, right? Nice and flat back from, let's say, my butt right through to my head. For a lot of you guys, that's gonna mean actively arching the back a little bit on the way down. I'm gonna see if you guys can see that. Actively arching the back a little bit on the way down. There's nothing inherently dangerous. It's okay if you feel like you're doing that. If you experience a ton of lower back sensation, we'll talk about it, but the RDL works your lower back too. So what sort of things am I actually thinking about while I'm doing the exercise? I think about sending my hips back, soft knee bend, going down till I feel a deep, 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 deep stretch, and then I think about pushing the ground down, right? I don't want you to think about pulling up with your back. I want you to think about pushing the ground down with your feet. And so as I'm descending, I'm pushing my hips back, soft knee bend, hips back, hips back, hips back, hips back, hips back. I get this super deep sensation. I feel like this is as low as I can go. And I'm thinking about pushing the ground down, maybe primarily through the heels, but I don't really want people to be thinking about that. I want you pushing down through the whole foot, but I don't want you to think about like someone's pulling you up by a string, I want you to think about pushing the world down. And so that can be really helpful for people that are feeling a lot in their back, thinking that this is gonna be like a muscling the bar up. It's not a muscling the bar up. As you're hinging back, deep stretch, neutral head position, push the ground down and stand up. And when you stand up, you don't have to squeeze your glutes, right? The one thing I definitely don't want is I don't want you to squeeze the glutes so hard that you do this, right? That you get out of this neutral position, you get into this extended position. If you squeezed your glutes and stood straight up, there's nothing wrong with that. Now, there's no tension on the glutes here, so you don't actually have to squeeze them. But if doing so helps you execute the movement in some way, I tend to have a little glute squeeze as I finish the movement, but I don't want you to go into this position here, but I don't mind if you stand up into this straight position, you squeeze your glutes, no problem at all. And so here's a set of RDLs. If you have questions, please ask them. It's, one of the most talked about exercises there is because it's just a wonderful exercise for the posterior chain, for your upper back, for your lower back, for your hamstrings, for your glutes, across the board here. So